The darkness inside the utility closet was not merely an absence of light, it was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest with the same brutal, crushing force that had just snapped the humerus bone in my left arm. I sat on the cold linoleum floor, my legs tucked awkwardly beneath me in a cramped fetal position, cradling the shattered limb against my ribs. The air was stale, thick with the chemical sting of bleach, old dust, and the metallic tang of fear that coated the back of my throat. It was the smell of cleaning supplies, a scent that should have been mundane, but in the tight, windowless confinement of this 3-by-4-foot prison, it smelled like violence. It was my 74th birthday. Outside the solid oak door, beyond the heavy brass lock that had clicked shut with a sound of finality that still echoed in my ears, life continued. I could hear them. The sounds were muffled but distinct, filtering through the cracks of the old house I had designed and built with my late husband 40 years ago. I heard the clinking of silverware against fine china. I heard the soft, ambient hum of jazz music playing from the speakers in the living room. They were eating. They were finishing the roast duck with cherry glaze that I had spent 6 hours preparing. My son, Julian, and his wife, Serena, were sitting at my mahogany dining table, beneath the Austrian crystal chandelier I had bought in Vienna after my first major architectural commission, eating my birthday dinner while I sat in the dark, broken and discarded like a piece of refuse. Pain radiated from my shoulder in blinding white pulses, a rhythmic agony that synced perfectly with the frantic, terrified beating of my heart. Every breath was a labor. Every slight shift of my weight sent a fresh shockwave of nausea rolling through my stomach. But the physical agony, as sharp and consuming as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological devastation that was currently dismantling my mind. My son had done this, Julian. The boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged with infinite tenderness, the boy whose tuition I had paid by working double shifts at the firm, sacrificing my own sleep and health so he would never know a day of want, the man whose hand I had held through his first divorce when he wept like a child on my sofa. He had grabbed me. He had looked into my eyes, not with recognition or love, but with a cold, annoyed detachment, and he had twisted my arm until the bone gave way with a sickening snap, and then he had dragged me here, shoving me into the darkness among the mops and buckets, and turned the key. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to find a center of gravity in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. How had the formidable Evelyn Clark, the architect who had designed some of the most resilient, storm-proof structures on the Oregon coast, allowed her own foundation to crumble so thoroughly? It hadn't happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow erosion, a structural failure caused by water seeping into the cracks over years, freezing and thawing, widening the fissures until the load-bearing walls simply gave way. It began 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in November, when Julian brought Serena home. I remembered the moment with a clarity that stung. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the cliffside house, and Julian walked in with a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a magazine editorial. Serena was 34, exactly 15 years younger than Julian. She had hair the color of spun gold, eyes that were a piercing, icy blue, and a smile that didn't quite reach them. She claimed to be a consultant for high-end art galleries, a vague title that seemed to explain her expensive taste, but not her lack of verifiable history. Julian, who had been drifting aimlessly since his 40s, battered by a midlife crisis and a stalled career in marketing, looked at her with a desperation that broke my heart. He looked at her as if she were the sun and he was a planet in danger of freezing without her orbit. I wanted to be happy for him. God knows, I wanted him to be loved. But from that very first dinner, I felt the chill. I remembered how Serena had walked through the house that first night. She didn't look at the architecture or the view of the Pacific Ocean churning below the cliffs. She looked at the antiques. She lingered over the silver tea service. She ran her fingers over the silk upholstery of the Louis XIV chairs. She wasn't admiring beauty. She was assessing inventory. She was calculating value. The erosion of my life began shortly after they moved in. It was a gradual process, executed with the precision of a demolition expert. They moved in 6 months after the wedding, under the guise of helping me maintain the manor. "The cliffside house is too big for you, Mom," Julian had said, his voice laced with a concern that I now realized was scripted by her. The upkeep is too much. Let us help. We can take care of the grounds, handle the bills, make sure you're not alone. I was 71 then. I was strong, independent, and perfectly capable, but I was also lonely. My husband had been gone for a decade. My friends were aging or moving away. The silence in the hallways was becoming louder every year. So, I let the Trojan horse in. I opened the gates and invited my destruction inside. Slowly, methodically, my territory was annexed. My study, the room where I had drafted the blueprints for the city library and the Maritime Museum, became Serena's office. She needed space for her consulting, she said. My garden, a chaotic and beautiful English cottage style I had cultivated for 30 years, was ripped out and replaced with minimal, architectural succulents that required expensive landscaping crews. And then came the gaslighting. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It started with small things. A missing pair of diamond earrings, a withdrawal from my checking account that I couldn't recall making. When I mentioned the missing items, Serena would smile, a sympathetic tilt to her head, a soft touch on my arm, and suggest that perhaps I was getting forgetful. Evelyn, you know how stressful retirement can be, she would say, her voice dripping with fake honey. Maybe you misplaced them. Maybe you spent that money and forgot. It happens to people your age. And Julian, my sweet, pliable Julian, would nod in agreement, his eyes avoiding mine, repeating the lines she had likely fed him in the privacy of their bedroom. Mom, you have been a little scattered lately. Maybe we should make an appointment with a neurologist, just to be safe. They planted the seeds of doubt in my own mind. I started to question my memory. I started to write everything down in notebooks, trying to catch myself slipping, but I never did. Because I wasn't slipping. I was being robbed. My circle of friends was the next casualty. Margaret, my oldest friend, a woman I had known since architecture school, stopped visiting. When I called her to ask why, she was evasive. Eventually, she told me the truth. Serena had called her. Serena had told Margaret that I was embarrassed by my declining mental state, that I was having episodes of aggression and confusion, and that I preferred isolation. They had built a wall around me, brick by brick, cutting off my supply lines, isolating the target before the final strike. But today, the illusion had shattered. The fog of doubt they had pumped into the house had cleared in an instant. 4 hours ago, I had walked into the dining room to set the table for my birthday dinner. I had wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted to believe, for one night, that we were a happy family. But when I entered the room, I found Serena sitting at my antique secretary desk, the one I kept locked. The lock had been picked. She was rifling through the papers with a terrifying efficiency. She wasn't just looking for cash this time. She held the deed to the house in her manicured hands. She was taking photos of it with her phone. The rage that surged through me then was volcanic. It wasn't the confusion of an old woman, it was the fury of a matriarch defending her legacy. I shouted at her. I called her a thief. I snatched the deed from her hands. Serena didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. She just laughed. It was a cold, metallic sound that chilled my blood. She stood up, towering over me in her heels, and told me the truth I had been denying for 3 years. "You're too late, Evelyn," she had said, her voice devoid of the sweet mask she usually wore. "Julian is already in the process of declaring you incompetent. We have the medical records, we have the testimony of your outbursts. We're going to sell this drafty old mausoleum, put you in a nice state-run facility where you can stare at the wall, and we're going to live the life we deserve." Then Julian walked in. He saw us. He saw his mother trembling with rage and betrayal. He saw his wife standing there with a smirk of triumph. For a split second, I thought he would save me. I thought the decades of love, of sacrifice, of shared history would outweigh the spell of this predator. I looked at him. "Julian, please," I begged. "She's stealing the deed. She's stealing the house." But Julian didn't look at the deed. He looked at Serena. She immediately dissolved into tears, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "She hit me, Julian," she sobbed, clutching her chest. "She's having one of her episodes. She attacked me." And Julian made his choice. He chose the lie. He chose the parasite over the host. He walked toward me, his face hardening into a mask of disgust. "Give it to her, Mom," he said cold. "You don't know what you're doing." I refused. I held onto that paper as if it were my soul. He grabbed my arm. I struggled. I told him he was hurting me. I begged him to stop. But he didn't stop. He twisted. The snap echoed in the silent room, like a gunshot. I screamed. The pain was immediate and blinding. I dropped the deed. Julian looked at my dangling arm, and for a second I saw panic in his eyes. But Serena was there, whispering in his ear, steering the narrative. "She's dangerous, Julian. She's going to hurt herself. We have to secure her until she calms down. Put her in the closet." And he did. He dragged his own mother, weeping and broken, down the hall and shoved me into the darkness. Now, sitting on the floor, I realized that the Evelyn Clark who begged for love was dead. She died the moment that bone snapped. In her place, something else was waking up. Something cold, something calculating. Something that remembered how to build structures that could weather any storm, and how to demolish those that were unsound. I shifted my weight, biting my lip to keep from screaming as my arm jostled against the mop bucket. With my good right hand, I reached into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan. My fingers brushed against the cool glass of my smartphone. They thought they had taken everything. They had removed the landline cordless phone from the kitchen weeks ago. They had taken my laptop, claiming I was sending confusing emails to the bank, but they didn't know about the burner phone. I had bought it 3 weeks ago, at a convenience store, paying cash. After finding a series of credit card applications in the recycling bin with my forged signature, I had hidden it in the pocket of my gardening apron, and today, by pure instinct, I had slipped it into my cardigan before dinner. I pulled it out. The screen glowed in the darkness, a beacon of hope in the abyss. 14% battery, 1 bar of signal. It was enough. I stared at the keypad. I could call the police. That was the logical step. But if I called the police, what would happen? They would come. Julian and Serena would meet them at the door. They would show them the medical records they had likely forged. They would claim I was senile, that I had fallen, that I was confused. It would be my word against theirs, and I was the crazy old woman locked in a closet. Even if they arrested Julian, Serena would bail him out. They would come back. They would punish me. No, I didn't need a patrol car. I need a wrecking ball. I needed a weapon that could cut through their lies with surgical precision. I scrolled through the contacts to a number I hadn't dialed in 10 years. I had transferred it from my old address book to this phone just in case. Arthur Sterling. Arthur wasn't a friend. He was a shark, a retired litigator who had been my fiercest rival when I was bidding for city contracts in the 90s. He represented the developers who wanted to tear down historic buildings. I represented the preservationists. We had fought in courtrooms and city council meetings for decades. He was ruthless, brilliant, arrogant, and possessed a moral compass that pointed strictly toward winning. But he owed me. 15 years ago, during the waterfront project, I had found evidence that could have disbarred him, a mistake his junior partner made. Instead of destroying him, I had handed him the file and let him fix it quietly. He had looked at me then, his gray eyes narrowed, and said, "Evelyn, you are a fool for saving me. But I pay my debts. If you ever need to bury a body or save a life, you call me." I pressed the call button. The silence in the closet was so deep I could hear the electronic purr of the connection. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Sterling," a voice rasped. It sounded like gravel and expensive scotch. He sounded older, but the edge was still there. "Arthur," I said. My voice was weak, trembling with pain, but I forced steel into it. "It's Evelyn Clark." There was a pause, a long, heavy silence. Then the tone shifted. The suspicion was replaced by curiosity. "Evelyn. I haven't heard that name since the Preservation Gala of 2010. You sound like hell." "I am in hell, Arthur." I took a breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hand. "I'm locked in a utility closet in my own home. My arm is broken, my humerus is snapped. My son and his grifter wife are eating my birthday dinner in the next room while they plan to liquidate my estate. They have forged power of attorney. They have the deed." I heard the sound of a chair scraping against a floor on the other end of the line. The casualness was gone. Did you call 911? He asked sharply. No. If I call the police, she'll spin it. She's a professional, Arthur. She has been gaslighting everyone for 3 years. She has records, fake witnesses. If the police come alone, she might talk her way out of it. Or worse, they'll take me to a psych ward based on her lies. I need you. I need you to come, and I need you to bring the entire cavalry. I need witnesses. I need a shark. Another pause. Shorter this time. I heard the jingle of keys. Where are you? Cliffside? Yes. I'm 30 minutes away. I'm calling the district attorney. He owes me a favor. I'm calling the chief of police. He owes me 5 favors. Don't die on me, Evelyn. The line went dead. I let the phone slide back into my pocket, my hand shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. 30 minutes. I could survive 30 minutes. I leaned my head against the wall and listened to the drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the darkness. Plip, plip, plip. It was a metronome, counting down the seconds of my waiting. The pain was evolving, turning from a sharp spike into a dull, consuming roar that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I focused on it. I let it sharpen my resolve. I thought about Julian again. I forced myself to remember, not the man who broke my arm, but the boy he was. I remembered him at 6, crying because a bird had died in the yard. I remembered him at 16, proud of his driver's license. Where had that boy gone? How had he been hollowed out so completely that only this husk remained? I realized then that I had been protecting him for too long. I had shielded him from failure, from consequences, from the harsh realities of the world. And in doing so, I had left him soft, vulnerable to a predator like Serena. I had built his walls with papier-mâché instead of brick. This was my failure as a mother, perhaps. But tonight, I would stop protecting him. Tonight, he would learn that actions have consequences. Time stretched and warped in the darkness. I drifted in and out of consciousness, anchored only by the throbbing in my arm and the cold floor beneath me. I heard laughter from the dining room. Serena's laugh. It sounded like breaking glass. They were probably toasting to their victory, to the house they would sell, to the money they would spend. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite, social ring. It was a long, insistent press that didn't stop. Silence fell over the house. The music stopped. I heard chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor, footsteps approaching the foyer. Julian's voice, muffled, asking who it was. Then, a thunderous pounding on the front door. "Open the door, Clark!" Arthur's voice boomed. It projected through the thick walls, a voice practiced in intimidating hostile witnesses. "I have the police with me. Open it or we take it down." I heard the heavy wooden door creak open. Then, a chaotic symphony of voices exploded in the hallway. I heard Arthur barking orders, the heavy tread of boots on the marble entryway, and Serena's shrill, indignant protests. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just barge in here. We are private citizens." "Where is she?" Arthur demanded. His voice was cutting. I don't know what you're talking about," Julian stammered. His voice was trembling. "She's in her room. She's resting. She's not well, Arthur. She has dementia. She gets confused." "Liar," I whispered in the dark. I tried to shout, but my throat was parched. I banged my good hand against the closet door. Once, twice. The sound was feeble against the noise outside. I grit my teeth, gathered every ounce of strength remaining in my 74-year-old body, and screamed. "Here! I'm in here!" The footsteps stopped. Then they thundered down the hall. "She's in the closet?" Arthur's voice was incredulous, laced with a fury I had never heard from him. "You locked your mother in a closet?" The handle of the closet jiggled. "It's locked!" Arthur yelled. "Kick it in!" There was a violent crash, wood splintering, and light flooded my prison. I squeezed my eyes shut against the sudden brightness. When I opened them, Arthur Sterling was kneeling beside me. He was wearing a tuxedo jacket over a t-shirt, clearly having left some event in a hurry. He took in the sight of me, the bruise spreading on my cheek, the unnatural angle of my left arm, the filth on my clothes, the tears drying on my face. His jaw tightened until a muscle feather in his cheek. "Jesus, Evelyn?" He turned his head toward the hallway, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Officer, in here, and get those 2 in cuffs, now." I saw Julian standing in the hallway, his face the color of ash. He looked at me, and then he looked at his hands, as if realizing for the first time what they had done. Serena was behind him, her face twisted in a snarl of fury, shouting about harassment and warrants, her mask of sophistication completely gone. Paramedics swarmed the small space. They were gentle, professional. They lifted me onto a stretcher. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through my shoulder, and the world tilted on its axis. As they wheeled me out of the closet, down the hallway I had walked 1,000 times, I passed Serena. She was being restrained by a burly officer, her hands cuffed behind her back, her eyes locked onto mine. "You crazy old witch," she spat, her voice venomous. "You'll pay for this. You're senile. No one will believe you." I looked at her. I really looked at her. And I felt nothing. No fear, no anger. Just the cold calculation of an architect looking at a building that needed to be condemned. "I already have," I whispered, my voice raspy but audible. "Now it's your turn." The hospital stay was a blur of sterile lights, the sharp prick of IV needles, and the hum of machines. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Evans, told me I had a spiral fracture of the humerus. It required surgery. They inserted a titanium plate and 6 screws to hold the bone together. He told me I was lucky. At my age, a fall like that could have been fatal if I had hit my head. Lucky. That was the word everyone kept using. Arthur was my constant shadow. He didn't leave. He set up a command center in the waiting room, turning the hospital into his temporary office. He hired a private investigator within hours of my admission. By the 3rd day, when I was lucid enough to talk strategy, he walked into my room and laid a thick manila folder on my bedside table. "Meet Leona Miller," Arthur said, pulling up a chair. I looked at the photo clipped to the front of the file. It was Serena, but her hair was dark brown and she was wearing glasses. "Or maybe you prefer Sarah Jenkins? Or Michelle Vaught?" Arthur continued, flipping through the pages. "She's a pro, Evelyn. She targets vulnerable families, usually with substantial assets and weak links in the family structure. She works the long con. She marries or seduces the heir, isolates the matriarch or patriarch, drains the accounts, and vanishes before anyone realizes the extent of the damage. She has warrants in 3 states for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse." I looked at the photos. The faces changed, but the eyes were always the same, calculating, empty. "And Julian?" I asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and painful. Arthur stopped flipping the pages. He looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected from a man known for his ruthlessness. "Julian is an accessory, Evelyn. He facilitated the fraud. He signed the checks. He allowed her access to the accounts. And most importantly, he committed assault, causing great bodily harm. We have the medical reports, the police report from the closet, and the financial records showing he signed off on the transfers. The district attorney is ready to charge them both." I closed my eyes. Tears leaked out, hot and fast. "My son, my little boy. He broke my arm." "Arthur?" I said softly. "He did. He left me in a closet to rot while he ate roast duck." "Yes." I took a deep breath. The pain in my arm was a dull throb, a constant reminder of the betrayal. "Burn them," I said. "Burn them both." The legal battle that followed was swift, brutal, and public. Arthur Sterling was not a man who played with his food. He froze every asset I had, locking Julian and Serena out of the accounts within hours. He evicted them from Cliffside House with a restraining order so tight they couldn't come within 5 miles of the property. I moved into a hotel suite downtown while the house was being swept for bugs and cleaned. I couldn't bear to go back yet. The ghost of the violence was still too fresh. I spent those weeks in a state of numbness. I went to physical therapy, gritting my teeth through the agony of relearning how to move my arm. I met with detectives. I gave statements. Serena, true to her nature, tried to cut a deal. From her jail cell, she offered to testify against Julian. She claimed he was the mastermind. She claimed she was a battered wife, forced to go along with his schemes. She painted my weak, foolish son as a criminal genius. It was a laughable lie, contradicted by the mountain of evidence Arthur had compiled, showing her history of doing this exact thing to 3 other families. Julian, on the other hand, fell apart. Without Serena's influence, without her voice in his ear, he crumbled. He called me from the county jail. I listened to the voicemails, sitting in my hotel room, looking out at the city skyline. Mom, please. I didn't know. I was brainwashed. I love you. Please, get me out. His voice sounded like a stranger's. It was the voice of a man who had never taken responsibility for anything in his life, begging for his mother to fix it one more time. But I didn't pick up the phone. On the day of the preliminary hearing, I walked into the courtroom with Arthur by my side. My arm was in a black silk sling that matched my suit. My back was straight. I wore my best pearls. I was not a victim. I was a witness. Serena looked diminished in the orange jumpsuit. Her roots were showing, a dark contrast to the dyed blonde. Without makeup, without her designer clothes, she looked ordinary. Mean, but ordinary. When she saw me, she sneered, but it lacked the power it once had. Julian wouldn't look at me. He sat hunched over at the defense table, staring at his hands. He looked broken. He looked like the child who had broken a vase and was waiting for the punishment. I gave my testimony. I spoke clearly, without tears. I described the theft. I described the isolation. I described the physical assault. I described the darkness of the closet and the sound of them eating dinner while I sat in pain. When the prosecutor asked me how I felt about the defendants, I looked directly at Julian. He finally raised his eyes to meet mine. They were red-rimmed and full of fear. I feel pity, I said into the microphone. I raised a son to be a man of integrity. Somewhere along the way, he decided it was easier to be a victim. And victims, I have learned, can be the most dangerous people of all, because they justify every cruelty as a necessity for their own survival. He sacrificed his mother to keep a woman who never loved him. That is a tragedy, but it is not an excuse. The judge was unamused by Serena's antics. Given her prior record, the severity of the assault on an elderly person, and the scale of the fraud, he threw the book at her. She was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. She screamed as they dragged her out, cursing me, cursing Julian, cursing the world. Julian's sentencing was quieter. His lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing manipulation, emotional distress, and a clean prior record. The judge looked at me. He asked if I had a statement regarding sentencing for my son. Arthur touched my elbow gently. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. But I did. I stood up. The room went silent. "Your Honor," I said, "my son needs help. He needs deprogramming. He needs to understand who he is without a manipulator pulling his strings. But actions have consequences. If I shield him from this, if I use my money and influence to get him out of this mess, as I have done his whole life, I am not loving him. I am enabling the weakness that allowed this to happen. I am finishing the job of destroying him. I ask for justice. Not vengeance, but justice." Julian received 4 years. When the gavel banged, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, exhausting relief. It was over. The cancer had been cut out. Now, I just had to survive the recovery. Returning to Cliffside House was the hardest part. The first night, the silence was deafening. I sat in the living room, staring at the spot on the floor where Julian had twisted my arm. I could still hear the snap. I could still smell the bleach from the closet. But I am an architect. I know that when a structure is compromised, you don't abandon it. You reinforce it, you strip it down to the studs, and you build it back stronger. I started renovations the next week. I tore out the dining room where they had eaten their dinner. I couldn't bear to look at that table again. I turned the space into a sunroom, filled with plants, light, and comfortable reading chairs. I burned the furniture from the guest room they had occupied. I repainted the walls from the trendy gray Serena had chosen to a warm ochre and sage green. I reconnected with Margaret. We cried together over tea, and she forgave me for pushing her away, understanding that it wasn't me who had done the pushing. I joined the board of directors for a local women's shelter. I used my experience and resources to help other women, especially older women, who were trapped in situations of coercive control and financial abuse. I helped design their new safe house, ensuring it was a place of light and security. 6 months later, I received a letter from Julian from prison. It was brief. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses. He simply wrote, "I am in therapy. I am learning who I am without her. I don't like him very much yet, but I hope, one day, to be someone you can look at without pain. I am so sorry, Mom." I didn't write back. Not yet. Forgiveness is a bridge, and I wasn't ready to start construction. The foundation was still settling. 2 years have passed since that night. I am 76 now. My arm aches when it rains, a permanent reminder of the price I paid for my freedom. The titanium plate sets off metal detectors at airports, but I am stronger than I have ever been. I am sitting on my new sun porch, watching the storm roll in over the Pacific. The waves crash against the cliffs, violent and beautiful. Arthur is here. He comes for dinner every Friday. We are not lovers, we are too old and too set in our ways for that complications, but we are companions in the truest sense. We are 2 old warriors who understand the cost of battle. He pours 2 glasses of Pinot Noir and sits opposite me. "You're thinking about him," Arthur says. It's not a question. He knows me too well. I nod. I wonder if he's cold. I wonder if he's eating enough. I wonder if he's finally becoming a man. "He's in a minimum security facility, Evelyn," Arthur says gently. "He's fine. He's safer there than he was with her. He's working in the prison library. He's reading again." I know. I take a sip of the wine. The wind howls against the reinforced glass, but the house holds firm. My house. My sanctuary. I have learned a hard lesson, perhaps the hardest one a mother can learn. We are taught that love is unconditional, that a mother's arms should always be open. But we are not taught that those arms can be broken by the very people we hold. I learned that boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are the load-bearing structures that keep us from collapsing. I learned that dignity is not a gift given to us by our children or society. It is a territory we must defend, sometimes with brutal force. And most importantly, I learned that while blood may be thicker than water, it is also slippery. You can drown in it if you aren't careful. I look at Arthur. I look at my beautiful, renovated home. I look at my own reflection in the glass, an old woman with a stiff arm, gray hair, and eyes that have seen the dark and chosen the light. I raise my glass. "To the builders," I say. Arthur smiles, the lines around his eyes deepening. He clinks his glass against mine. "To the survivors." I drink, and the wine tastes like victory. I am Evelyn Clark. I am broken, I am mended, and I am finally, completely free.